person that was in charge of, that was an officer during this time, was the provost marshal, who would become Representative Sidney Clark. So you can see Sidney Clark, since he's at Leavenworth and is the provost marshal in charge of who's going to be assigned to what duty, it's obvious that he has connections to Custer, and he probably had connections with Payne. So in 1876, the Choctaw began taxing the MK&T. They started asserting their sovereignty. Now, this is owned by a famous man named Gould. He's the primary owner of that. Now, the reason that's important is because you're going to start seeing New York banking interest involved in Oklahoma politics. In June 1876, Custer goes into what would become his last stand. In 1878, the Creeks built their very, very prominent Capitol building there in Okmulgee. But by 1879, we have a presidential Rutherford B. Hayes talking about certain evil deposed persons, specifically the Boomers, David Payne and Boomer William Couch, that they're trying to violate the treaties of the tribes and that they're invading Indian territory. And in fact, prior to 1882, Frisco Railroads had bought 5,000 shares, paying for David Payne to invade the Indian tribes. So they can't get agreements with the tribes, so they're going to figure out a way to take it from within. 1880, Bacone, as we mentioned, was founded. But in 1880, in the report of the Commissioner of Affairs, he says that there's an invasion ongoing in Indian territory. Robert Gould who controls MK&T, starts sending lobbyists into the Indian territory to intimidate the 5 tribes. He's basically saying, you either deal with me or we're going to get it another way. So by 1881, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs admits that there's intruders. When his last report made, there were 6,000 intruders who have no rights in the country, specifically the Boomers, led by Payne. Now remember, Payne was part of Custer's movement against the Cheyenne and Arapaho, so he's obviously very anti-Indian. 1881, Judge Parker begins his court against Payne, and interestingly enough, Frisco Railroad hires Judge James Baker to defend Payne. 1881, Kansas Senator Lane, who's the president of Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad, sends $500 to support David Payne's during his trial. In other words, pay for his food and expenses. 1881, Colonel Charles Carpenter begins working with the Cherokee School Superintendent, S.S. Stevens, to establish the Veneta branch of the Colonization Society. This time he is working for the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. In 1882, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs says that legislation is needed because of the intruders. Henry Candinal College is founded in 1882 by the Muskogee. Before it moves to Tulsa, it becomes TU. Standard Oil in 1882 was seeking drilling and rights on tribal lands and was working through the Interior Department. Specifically, Rockefeller said it's better to operate through your own people if it can be done. He was wanting oil that he heard was inside of Indian territory. Choctaw built their Capitol building in 1885. And by Proclamation 266, President Cleveland prohibits settlement of non-Indians on Oklahoma lands in the Indian Territory. Again, trying to keep Boomer David Payne and William Couch out of the property. 1886, Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific Railroad. For some reason, the Supreme Court agrees, and they agree that the 14th Amendment, which was provided for slaves to ensure that slavery could never happen again, applies the 14th Amendment as equal protection to corporations. This means that the railroads are trying to say that they have rights that citizens do. Then the Dawes Act in 1887 is passed by Senator Dawes of Massachusetts. As we mentioned already, he was part of the Credit Mobilier scandal. So he was already pro railroad. Possibly, and historically, it needs to be determined if in fact he was acting on behalf of the railroads when he proposed the Allotment Act. The Kansas City, Lawrence, and Southern Railroad begins advertisements in 1883 of opening up Indian Territory. In fact, their map, if you look at it, when they put out these promotions for their railroad, shows their line ending right at what now is the line straight down into Guthrie, and then from there, what is now Oklahoma City on I-35. So you're starting to see the railroads actively want to open Indian Territory. So it's owned by this man, H.H. Honeywell from Boston, Massachusetts. He will later sell his company to Santa Fe Railroad. So suddenly the Springer Amendment is adopted in the Indian Appropriations Act of 1889, and as soon as that's signed, the unassigned land in the middle of Indian Territory becomes the first land run. So the relationship between the railroads, Payne, and the taking over of Indian land can directly be seen in this direction between Union soldiers, former Union soldiers who became senators and representatives like Clark, and also the active engagement of the railroads to take over tribal land. As you see in this slide, Sidney Clark was on the board of directors for the St. Louis and Oklahoma City Rail Company. 1889, the Cherokee rebuilt Cherokee Female Seminary after it had gone through a fire. Judges, juries, and state officials were recipients of the largest of the railroads. The free pass was the least of the common evils indulged in. In other words, if you were a senator or a representative or a judge, the railroads would give you a free pass where you could take your family on vacations. In other words, the railroads were actively buying legislation against the tribes. In fact, when he was a territorial lawyer, Governor Henry Johnston stated in 1932, in the territorial days, every Supreme Court justice carried a railroad pass in his pocket, and his family could be assured of spending each summer at the seashore. So the link between railroads and the taking of Indian property in the land run was an orchestrated crime.